were okay. There was some glitches.
My topic.
A couple glitches. Okay, come on. Some ums. You need to speak a little bit. Your voice is a little too soft.
That's what every single person ever has told me that.
You want this stick?
For good?
Yes.
Jab it in Molly's eye.
It's next to the blade.
Yeah, it does look quite interesting.
It's a steel blade. Let's use a steel blade. No.
Oh wait, is that the soil you go from?
Yeah.
Wait,
Oops.
Right.
how do you? Can you like?
Let's see. Oh, it's a table. So let's straighten these chairs out a little bit. Let's do these. Let's get a row going back here. And four. Get pull one of them. We've got two here. One of them back here. I forgot to take roll. Who's out? It was two people. Veronica and.
Yes.
Well. There we go. Some future stars who want to be. You be future stars. That's a wannabe right there. Anyone in ninth grade gets nothing above wannabe status. Whoa, man, the myth, the legend. Okay, what's the passing grade for president? We have a B plus, A minus, and A plus.
Yeah.
We always say pretty high.
It's called A. Because you were like.
I love the fingernail polish. It's a great match with the outfit.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, we only have 4 minutes. Bear cross. I forgot to take a roll. Everyone was here. Come on in, friends and foes.
Presley.
Oh, look at this. Oh, Mary. Okay. Just remember. You don't need to speak that fast. Go, Presley. If you go, I'll just try to give you those. Just slow down. Okay? You got this. Just keep that in your head. You know what's secure.
You can just fly to us for 20 minutes here and now you know.
Hey! Last day.
Oh, wait, what is that?
All right, ninth grade wannabe, future stars right here, Miss Lavin. You know that we were partners in there. We were awesome. We almost came back. What? Oh, wow. All right, family members are going to our friend outside. Committee members come here. All right, look at you on a committee member. You finally made it. You're a star now. You're an academic star. After two wonderful children. Jake, were you family? You be in that room. She's now. She missed the other now. right, where's the youngsters? Where's the future people in the back there? Look at them. Nice women. Those are stars. Stars are people. Jacob gets the last.
Everyone will see each other on like the
So all the A3 people here, George, Ethan, Sid. Sarah's not because she's sick. Yeah. I don't know whether she's coming or not.
No, she's not.
No, I meant she's sick.
Oh.
Yeah, extra roll. Way to go, Rod. Thank you. Of course, it's illegal to burn candles in here, so Rocky did it, not me. I'll take it. I'll take the blame if someone comes in. We're waiting on one committee member and then Ms. King. So hopefully everything will go in. Welcome to day 11, final day. Defenses 21 and 22. It's been a great 2.5 weeks. Awesome.
Are you sad it's over?
I don't know. It's been a rough, like 13, 14-hour days, but I wouldn't want it any other way. Yeah, look at my 9th graders wanting to be stars down the road. Look at them. Isn't that cool? They want to be like Presley and Kate. Kate Martin she's not. Oh, she said it was great. 9th graders, you got your topics picked out for 3 years from now? Yeah, no pressure.
I wanted to do rap.
Harrison, you had a long list of topics.
I also wanted to do Satanism.
No, gang culture. Wasn't it gang culture?
Yeah, that's it.
Oh. You're going to a Catholic university.
Yeah, I would have preferred to call it. Yeah.
Things are going downhill. Remember in the old days when we were killing it here? Remember when you were down here? Full disclosure, Ms. Laffer here for the young people in the audience. At one point, she was part of our trivia team. We had a trivia team that was the students and faculty together on a trivia team, and we killed it. We were in the regional finals. The prize was $25,000 we were up
And
for.
6-foot trophy that we didn't win.
We didn't win, but she was an awesome trivia player. Any useless information about movies and TV, she had it. I had the social science and sports stuff down.
You consider doing the football team?
Well, if we ever get trivia back, now that COVID's over, maybe trivia will once again, this would have been a great, imagine Saturday playing trivia.
That would have been fun.
It was so intense, because I like intenser ones.
Yes.
I mean, like pounding my fist, high fives all the time. Come on in, right here. I'll mention this committee and specifically, and I haven't done this yet through the defenses, but one of the awesome aspects of Thesis is being able to bring in people that are not necessarily high school instructors or teachers. This is a good example. I felt enough confidence in knowing Presley as she's a 4-timer and my 4-time group. I acknowledged them earlier today, but that I could, trust her writing ability, obviously having written papers for me in 10th, 11th grade, but to be able to put, middle school teachers, administrators, our tech guru, Ms. Lafferty, Ms. Ford, who sent me 2 lovely, awesome students for Thesis, 2 of the best projects. That's one sitting right up there highlighted. So this has been great to bring them into the fold. There's over 30 faculty members and staff members on committees this year, and I think next year we'll have more than that. So I've already got some new teachers asking to be on committees next year. Now that we're all here, family, committee members, this has been a great topic. Again, if you sat in yesterday, some parallels between multiple topics this year. A lot on American politics. I mean, from Harrison and Layla to Jake and Presley, we're hitting those themes that are very timely, very relevant in American society today. And this topic, again, Presley killed it, looking at the issue of trust in government and accountability in government, again, something that Jake hit on yesterday. I think you're really going to enjoy this presentation. Let's give it up for President.
I just want to thank everybody for coming out. My name is Leslie Brown, as you've already heard, and so I'll be presenting my thesis entitled "The Anti-Patriot Act: The Exploitation of America in the Name of National Security." I did a lot of research over the course of this year for this project, and I think that my most important source was this report from the Department of Justice entitled "The September 11 Detainees: A Review of the Treatment of Aliens Held on Immigration Charges in Connection with the Investigation of the September 11 Attacks." Essentially, this source was a comprehensive overview of the government's actions immediately following 9/11 until about 4 months afterwards. And it had this chart in it, which I actually used in the paper, which just kind of showed the convoluted nature of the detainment of immigrants as well as their release. And then this brings us into my first chapter, 9/11 and America's Fall from Liberty. America was founded on the ideals of freedom and civil liberties, and the Founding Fathers instilled a weariness of the government into America's political culture across the aisle. However, as time has gone on, American society has drifted from its focus on freedom, and the government has been able to extend its reach, on many occasions violating America's Charters of Freedom, the Bill of Rights, Constitution, and Declaration of Independence. Although checks and balances have been established in the government, as overreach falls through the cracks, historically, little has been done to curtail the power of the government and its officials. Beginning in the 1930s, the federal government began to encroach on citizens' privacy through wiretapping, and in today's society, this encroachment has become far more egregious. The federal government has historically been able to take advantage of American citizens through passing vague legislation and leaving it up to interpretation. This allows the government to expand its powers at the expense of American freedoms while still acting within the law. Some of the most prominent examples of this legislation include the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, or FISA, and the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty of 1996. September 11, 2001 was one of the most consequential days in American history, and its effects are still felt in today's America. 19 members of terrorist group Al-Qaeda, based in Afghanistan and supported by the Taliban, hijacked 4 American planes using box cutters and altered their trajectories, carrying out an unprovoked attack on American soil, with the death toll almost reaching out of Pearl Harbor. Nearly every single American can recall where they were when they found out about 9/11, and even those across the country felt the impacts of terrorism both on this day and in the following months. Fewer than 10% of Americans claim that the events of September 11, 2001 had an insignificant emotional impact on them as well as their day-to-day lives, while nearly 70% claim its effects were substantial and lasting. Regardless of whether or not a citizen lost a colleague or loved one in the towers or on Flight United 93, Americans felt connected to this attack unlike any other in their lifetimes. Many Americans became obsessed with the idea of terrorism and external threats to American society following the attacks. Whether it was the endless replay by the media, novelty of the attack, or heartbreaking death toll, the attacks changed citizens' perceptions of America's role on a global scale and led to an arguably irrational fear in regards to national security and America's place in the world. The attacks of September 11, 2001 were catastrophic in the U.S. in terms of the economy, death count, and sense of national security. However, the long-standing consequences on the American psyche as a whole were by far the most detrimental. More specifically, how these changes in judgment led to Americans to passively allow for the passage of blatantly unconstitutional legislation in the hopes it would prevent another attack of similar magnitude. The events of 9/11 left the American government scrambling to create order in society once again. George Bush pushed for the passage of extreme legislation in an effort to unite the American people and ease the newfound sense of anxiety plaguing American society. The passage of the Patriot Act was the hallmark of these bills. This legislation was passed less than 2 months after the attacks on October 26, 2001, and authorized significant changes in the American government. With only 2 months for the bill to be written, reviewed, and passed, there was no possibility of a thorough examination. However, with nationalism at an all-time high following these attacks, congressmen on both sides of the aisle were put in a difficult position. Much of the public had a with us or against us mentality regarding terrorism in the United States, and it is likely that pointing out the flaws present within the Patriot Act would have been considered anti-American sentiment. While the unity brought about by 9/11 created a much more connected and supportive society, the blind nationalism surrounding the Patriot Act has led to the erosion of both the Constitution and the rights of Americans. This brings us into my next chapter, Life, Intrusion, and the Pursuit of Happiness. The Fourth Amendment states the right of people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. The components of the Fourth Amendment are primarily in place today to ensure American citizens have privacy from the government while still allowing for investigations in cases of illegal activity, whether that be in their homes, cars, or digitally. The most important aspect of the Fourth Amendment is the outlining of probable cause. In order to curtail disputes, the Bill of Rights outlines where a citizen's right to privacy can and should be overridden by the government's role in justice. Following the 9/11 attacks, countless investigations with little to no merit took place, landing many immigrants in prison based on nothing concrete other than race, and a justice system unable to protect the constitutional rights of citizens due to the passage of the Patriot Act. United States versus Noel was a pivotal court case in highlighting the overreach of government this time. The plaintiffs were Basali Saeed Noalan and 3 other accomplices. The men were 4 Somali immigrants who were living in California while keeping strong connections to foreign organizations, many of which were deemed for as foreign terrorist organizations under Section 302 of the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, as mentioned earlier. This means that it's against the law for U.S. citizens to provide any support, financial or otherwise, to these organizations. Among these groups were Al-Shabaab, based in Somalia, the Kurdistan Workers' Party established in Turkey, and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam in Sri Lanka. While there was little to no dispute that the plaintiffs were in support of these organizations and providing financial aid, the constitutionality of the way in which the government went about gathering this information was under investigation. Because the NSA used metadata collection to collect the information used to convict the plaintiffs, it was deemed as an invasion of their privacy. However, even without the metadata collected through the allowances of FISA, there is enough evidence to bring criminal charges against the plaintiffs. United States versus Malala is a primary example proving that justice can be served without violating the constitutional rights of citizens, and that the Patriot Act fails to abide by the boundaries put in place by the Fourth Amendment. The Sixth Amendment states, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district where the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. The events of 9/11 and the subsequent passing of legislation, such as the Patriot Act, primarily violated the conditions of the Sixth Amendment, requiring defendants to have the right to be considered innocent until proven guilty, a fair and speedy trial, right to counsel, and to be informed of the nature of the crimes of which they are being accused of. 3 days after the 9/11 attacks, President Bush declared that America was in a state of national emergency. This declaration left America's transfixed in their post-9/11 state, willing to do anything to once again ensure their safety. The desperation of U.S. citizens to restore the state of America pre-9/11 led to extreme oversight by the government and practically no backlash by the public. The U.S. government involved the public in the following investigation to an unprecedented extent, giving merit to all allegations, even those who did not deserve it. No matter the nature of the allegations, suspects reported by other citizens were labeled as of interest and not released until enough evidence was procured proving they had no terroristic connection. This directly violates the detainee's constitutional rights to be considered innocent until proven guilty. Additionally, when evidence proving innocence or guilt was difficult to procure, the government would use cases of immigration violations, primarily staying past the expiration date of their visas, entering the country without inspection, or entering the country with invalid immigration documents as leverage against detainees. Suspects, almost entirely composed of immigrants and others of ethnic identity, were essentially detained for baseless allegations and remained in detention centers for as long as the government could hold them without raising too many questions. This discrimination at the hands of the government only further fueled the social conflict between a large sector of America and many foreigners, no matter their country of origin or religion. Hate crimes, although not an entirely new concept to America, became more commonplace. Attacks against people and institutions, quote, perceived to be Arab included destruction of property, public harassment, arson, vandalism of places of worship, death threats, physical assaults, and even murder. No matter the political, social, or economic state of the country, it is inherently American that the civil liberties of U.S. citizens are protected and the actions of the American government remain just and humane. The attacks of 9/11 and the federal government's reactions have made it abundantly clear to Americans that it is up to citizens to fight for the freedom granted to us by the Constitution because the government will not. And this brings us into my third chapter, How We Got Here, a closer look into the social and political shifts of contemporary America. The distinct lack of regard for the Constitution and American citizens has proven to be negligence on the part of the government at the very least. While at the time of its emergence, the Patriot Act was widely supported and helped to pull America out of post 9/11 state of emergency, its reauthorization by Congress in 2005, and the fact that it remained in place until decades later has had grave consequences that were entirely avoidable. While it is difficult to pinpoint an exact date in which the Patriot Act outlived its necessity, over the past 20 years, it became clear that its disadvantages far outweigh its advantages. Although the government was created with benevolent intentions and safeguards in place to prevent government overreach, there have been many key periods of change in America's history in which the government grew tremendously in a short period of time. Through Roosevelt's progressive era, Roosevelt's New Nationalism and the New Deal, and World War II, the government grew exponentially. Currently, the United States is in a similar position to that of the early 1940s. The conditions provided by the recent outbreak of the pandemic have given the government the same opportunities for growth. Unfortunately, the government has taken advantage of these opportunities, as well as the crisis entirely, prioritizing gaining power over the health and well-being of its citizens. COVID-19 has provided the federal government an excuse to grow through limiting the rights of the people. While many were deemed necessary and their effectiveness remains largely unproven, the state and federal mandates put into place after the outbreak of COVID-19 were entirely unconstitutional. Whether or not those restrictions were in the best interest of the American people, the lack of choice in these matters does not fall in line with American values. Due to the novelty and mysterious nature of the outbreak, the majority of citizens were compliant with the restrictions put in place by local, state, and federal authorities. However, as the pandemic continues to affect the lives of citizens, there's been much more backlash against heavy regulation and concern of government overreach and the loss of civil liberties. In recent years, social justice has become a more prevalent issue in U.S. culture, ranging from race to gender identity to animal rights. However, oftentimes the push for a more politically correct society can also lead to one in which individual rights are limited. Additionally, the end goals of these movements are often changes in public policy. In today's America, social issues are often politicized to garner support and votes. Where social change is needed, activists often call for a political solution, leading to the further expansion of the government into social matters. As Americans continue to ask the government to assist in social problem solving, the more likely the government is to overstep and encroach upon the rights of citizens. The willingness of Americans to sacrifice their constitutional freedoms in the name of social justice leaves the United States in a vulnerable position. The Patriot Act's blatant disregard for civil liberties helps set this precedent in the minds of American citizens. Living under a system of government in which the rights and liberties of citizens are not the first priority has led to citizens becoming complacent in their erosion of their constitutional guarantees. As America's social and political climates have shifted in the wake of the Patriot Act, U.S. citizens have shifted to placing a higher value upon political correctness and perceived morality as opposed to the preservation of civil liberties, leading to America's current alarming state in which the First, Second, and Sixth Amendments are all in danger of being disregarded. This leads us to my final chapter. Where do we go from here? The most significant problem today's America is facing is the government encroaching upon the rights of citizens and a population without the means or willingness to stop this from happening. The federal government has failed to prove its trustworthiness in regulating its power while not under heavy scrutiny. Within the last several decades, the U.S. Constitution has, in many ways, been entirely disregarded, and the government continues to experience unprecedented growth. While the Patriot Act of 2001 helped to act as a catalyst for this disheartening change, it is far from the only piece of legislation that has overstepped the boundaries set in place by the Constitution. The fact that congressmen do not have term limits is in and of itself proof of the extensive power politicians and special interest groups have in Washington. There are practically no downsides for the public in regards to imposing term limits on Congress, and the advantages America would face are substantial. To name a few, counterbalancing incumbent advantages, ensuring congressional turnover, securing independent congressional judgment, and reducing election-related incentives for wasteful government spending. Additionally, this would do a great deal to improve public opinion of Washington and help restore trust in the government. Currently, America is experiencing a growth in distrust in the government and its institutions. 61% of Americans claim that they have lost significant trust in Congress since the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. If the trust in government were to increase, the system as a whole would be more equipped to combat other pressing issues. According to Dan Greenberg, a political scientist, trust is the foundation for the legitimacy of public institutions in a functioning democratic system. It is crucial for maintaining political participation and social cohesion. When citizens lose trust in the government, they tend to refrain from actively participating in political settings. This presents a great threat to the democratic nature of America's system of government and leads to elected officials in office who do not truly represent the will of the people. Fortunately, the idea of term limits was introduced to the 116th Congress, which served from January of 2019 to January of 2021. It proposed an amendment to the U.S. Constitution in order to state how many terms a member of Congress should be able to serve. More specifically, those serving in the House could not serve more than 3 terms, and those serving in the Senate could not serve more than 2. However, this bill did not receive a vote before the end of the session when Congress dissolved and was therefore cleared from the votes. Due to the unfortunate circumstances leading to the bill not being voted on, the support it had behind it truly was unknown. While policy changes such as term limits can instill social change long term, it does not address the problem directly. While education is a priority in the United States, many important topics seem to fall through the cracks. Education, when correctly implemented, can be the most effective catalyst for change in terms of both the individual and the community. While there is no doubt that America's guarantee of civil liberties has weakened, the reasoning behind it is much more complicated. Whether it ties back to an increased desire for national security, political correctness, or disinterests, citizens have allowed for the government to overstep dramatically into the liberties guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. This is largely because the average citizen does not know how to go about addressing government overreach. While many citizens are not content with the role of government or the prospect of losing any more liberties, without the proper knowledge of how to address this issue, there is little that can be done in response. This problem highlights the need for more extensive education regarding the function and role of government, citizens' rights, and the legislative process as a whole. If these subjects were taught more in depth in America's primary and secondary schooling, the next generation of adults would be equipped to effectively handle a government encroaching upon the rights of citizens. Finally, while it's easy to look to the past during times of national emergencies and claim that the government overreacted, during these times the government is largely doing its best to ensure the well-being of the nation and its citizens. Unfortunately, intentions are largely irrelevant when considering the consequences that have surfaced as a result of much of the legislation that has been passed in these trying times for the nation. The unintentional consequences of legislation such as the Patriot Act serves as proof that the current safeguards in the federal government does not do an adequate job of protecting American citizens from government overreach. Thank you.
Is this a federal government problem? You alluded to state and local authorities also maybe involved in overreach. So is this just a national or is it a state local government problem? How all encompassing do you think this is?
I definitely think that it starts as a federal problem, but as it becomes more of the political culture that overreach is kind of accepted, I think that state and local authorities begin to fall into the same kind of line.
Of the 3 major branches of government, not kind of the bureaucracy is the branch, executive, Congress, judiciary, is this infecting all 3 branches? Or as you had mentioned Congress and you mentioned term limits in your recs, is this more of an executive problem or is it across all spectrums?
I think it's pretty much across all spectrums. I didn't get to include it in my presentation, but judicial review has largely been suspended in a lot of cases, and I believe that kind of the brushing aside of the judiciary just creates a bigger problem of Congress and the executive branch overstepping.
I've got one more, but I'm going to pass it down. We've got a lot of committee members here. Whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, personally, I'm just interested in all your research. If a lot's happened in 20 years. That we've seemed like we've spiraled in society, and you said a lot really fast, and I took a lot of great notes. And I'm not gonna read back through them all. But did you read anything that talked about any projections, or where do you think we're going? I mean, 20 years from now is not very long. If we don't begin to right the ship on some of these things, where are we going to be, as a society with regard to our relationship with our government, our trust we have? And
I definitely do believe that America, if no change is taken, is going to unfortunately kind of trench into the authoritarian direction where the executive branch just grows in power, and citizens are largely just kind of marginalized in what the government does and don't really have a say in what's happening in their nation.
if you picked one, I mean, this was kind of a broad topic, and you did a great job of packaging all that you researched together. But if you could kind of pick one piece of it, carry this project on and expand, what part do you think that would be?
Tosh and I kind of talked about this morning, just the role of surveillance and government overreach. I kind of talked a little bit about metadata collection
Yeah.
in the case of the Fourth Amendment. And I just think that that's incredibly interesting, just as far as like, even like security cameras, things like that, and just like how much the government has access to and how like how little privacy citizens truly have, and things that we don't even know the government knows about us.
You're a great writer. Your paper, I was super impressed on your research and just the way you presented it all. It was easy to read and clear and wonderful. I think it's interesting, the quote that you have about the intentions are inconsequential when the government overreaches. But we all know that there are people who don't believe that, who believe the intentions were to overreach from the beginning. And so I just wonder how we fight that, because you also mentioned, when people gain distrust and then they become disinterested and they quit listening. And so it's just kind of a problem. And I wondered if you came across any research on how you fight the distrust of the government. People who, like conspiracy theory, that sort of thing.
Yes. That was actually Kostof's project, which I got to be on his editing group, and I thought that he presented a lot of interesting things, just like education as a whole.
Right.
It's hard to educate people against like the will of the government, but I think it's important just to have some faith in our political institutions. It's kind of like democracy is very important to America, and if you have no faith that the people in power at least are trying to do what's right, I think that the system just kind of falls apart.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
And your paper was great, the presentation. I just found from the beginning your topic so interesting. Do you plan to go into law in some capacity in the future?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, that's it. I'm so excited. Good job. You obviously started with Patriot Act, but like in the last couple of weeks, it's been so relevant, particularly with First Amendment, like Elon Musk and Twitter and disinformation board that's proposed this week and everything. When you just said the average citizen just doesn't know how to address overreach, and education, this is great. And then I think in your paper you talked about adversarial review.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that's really feasible? Like with our divided political environment now, can you see the legislature compromising in times of crisis?
Honestly, I'm not entirely in a perfect society they would,
Right.
and I think that if the culture can kind of just be changed, even like gradually, if this can be implemented over the next 30 years, I think that it would just do a lot to push America in the right direction. I know that all of this is not going to happen overnight, but if we could just move a little bit in the direction, it would, I think, take America a long way.
Ms. King?
You did a great job. I was like on the edge of my seat the whole time. So if we're making parallels kind of between 9/11 and maybe COVID, and we can talk about the high number of deaths, and we can talk about the overreaches as being something that's implemented in order to keep us safe, and there's this kind of overwhelming sense of fear that surrounds both contexts. What was different? Because there was a lot of support for the Patriot Act, and then of course there was a lot of division around the mandates and everything like that. What was different with COVID that really caused such public outcry?
I think that a lot of the difference is that it was affecting pretty much every citizen. Like, whereas 9/11 Patriot Act, the detainees were largely marginalized people. It was mostly immigrants, and then otherwise just some foreign people with foreign ties. And then now with COVID, these mandates were affecting everybody, and I think that it was just a lot more in the center. Like, obviously with 9/11, it was all over the news, but it wasn't necessarily the government's actions that were in the news. It was Al-Qaeda, and then now with COVID mandates, it was, what you cannot do anymore because the government is mandating against it to keep us safe.
Did you come across any watchdog organizations that could help kind of keep tabs on what the government's doing and when the government's overstepping its bounds, et cetera? Because the media has kind of failed us. So is there anything out there, organizations that you saw at all that are doing a good job of kind of keeping us aware of what's happening?
There was the ACLU, if you kind of consider that a watchdog organization. It's kind of, I guess, a little bit less in support of the government than a lot of other things. But as far as like truly finding things out, it's hard to kind of differentiate between like conspiracy theory sources and then sources that actually have like concrete evidence. Especially just like I feel like the government is becoming so like closed off, I guess, within itself. Like a lot of things are like only within politicians, and that just doesn't get released a lot.
Yeah, we had mentioned at the very end, going even into something like the National Security Agency, which we don't even know where the buildings are, we don't know what the budget is, and we just know it exists and there's billions of dollars going to it, but we have no accountability. And that's, I guess, one of the key words would be accountability. There seems to be lacking. We've got a real esteemed audience out here that I know has a lot of questions, so I'm going to open it up to one last time, not last time, next to last time, to this group. Go ahead.
Good stuff.
So, being on your editing committee, I certainly saw a lot of your projects sort of progress over this year. So, I know you had to cut down quite a bit over the course of your presentation. So, I was wondering, was there any points or concepts in your presentation that you'd like to expand upon or was notable?
Well, he's still here's this question.
A lot of what I really had to cut was the connection between. So I touched a little bit on it, but like social change as a result of political change and the other way around. And I just wish that I could have talked a little bit more and even researched a little bit more if I would have had more time about how intertwined America's political and social culture is, which Jake kind of went into how Tosh that gets, and I found his reading to be really engaging.
So given like how you'd analyze both the 9/11 and COVID, and like looking at like again like this case as kind of like this idea of like collective security versus individual encroachment, do you think that there's a line that the government must like abide to? Or do you think there's a way to reconcile and try to protect both without like was there a right way to do one or the other?
I mean, I feel like it's easier to look back and kind of say where mistakes were made, but like at the time, I'm not sure there was like a solid line that the government like crossed in one place. I think that it's very important to obviously balance the safety of citizens as well as the liberties of citizens. And I think that a lot of times government probably, in my opinion, went too far into kind of control in order to consider safety. It's just kind of like it's a give and take between freedom and guaranteed safety. And I think that, that's up to the citizens of a country to kind of voice what they think the government should and should not be able to do.
This is just kind of like going into your actual like writing process. How did you like remove political bias and kind of like also looking as to like how your analysis could be both include your own like political voice, but also at times being partial and have it interesting.
Honestly, what I found was that a lot of my sources were extremely biased in one way or the other. So, and I feel like it was kind of easy to tell where the bias was at. So, through reading both kind of far left and far right opinions, I feel like I was kind of able to get like a good picture of like what the truth was, and then obviously like within my recommendation and things like what I think should be done to combat these things. Jake?
I also enjoyed being on your editing committee and sharing sources throughout the year. When you were talking about term limits, is that something that you think that you could see having enough support for a constitutional amendment? And do you think that there could be some sort of cultural change if there's not support for a constitutional amendment? A cultural change where people maybe decide not to vote for people or where people decide to maybe vote for people that pledge only serving a limited number of terms.
I think that it definitely gets difficult there, and I think that term limits for Congress has a lot of support amongst the public, but I don't necessarily think it would pass like in a vote just because so many in Congress have had their seat for so long and don't seem to be too keen on giving it up for term limits. As far as social change, I would hope that people would kind of move to voting for people who pledge to only serve a certain number of terms, and maybe at that point something could pass. But I honestly don't see people changing like these people that they voted for a while just to kind of have congressional turnover. If that makes sense.
Didn't we talk about that? Did Thesis talk to you in the year?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember we thought about turbulence as actually.
Krista?
So you mentioned trust and distrust between government and people. So looking at the perspective of an individual as an American citizen, what fears and why should they care about the breakdown of trust between government and themselves?
Why citizens should care about the breakdown
Yes.
of trust? Kind of as I mentioned, just like the breakdown of trust just leads to the erosion of the democratic process. And I feel like it's definitely reasonable for citizens to fear that if democracy is to erode so much that the government just decides to change the form of government and to authoritarian or something similar to that, like I do believe that at that point citizens would at least realize that they've kind of gotten to a point of no return, and I just think that it's important that citizens kind of recognize what's going on before we get there. Grayson?
One thing that I struggled with, like my topic, is the idea of trust. And Jake talked about it yesterday, where it's like the U.S. a certain level, democracy requires a certain level of mistrust and like not fully trusting everything the government does. So how, in your research and just in your opinion, how do you balance a healthy level of trust and mistrust? And are there almost two different definitions of trust in that sense?
I definitely think that like wariness of the government is important. I think that like kind of your two definitions, I think that it's important for governments to, or citizens to place trust in government institutions, but at the same time not be so trusting that they look the other way when rights are being violated, or just like kind of negative impacts of being trusting are kind of being seen.
Did anyone oppose the Patriot Act? Was there any voices out there in the wilderness?
There were a couple of, I think there were like 4 or 5 senators maybe who were kind of against it and kind of warned that kind of exactly what was going to happen would have happened. But they were largely kind of marginalized, and they were kind of called crazy at the time, just because they didn't support American government.
Would be a good profiles and courage essay.
It would.
Yeah, if someone who's down the road, 9th graders who could heard me say that, think about that next fall. Other questions from the audience? One more, Harrison.
I remember at the beginning of the year, Thomas told us like, don't go into your topic with an already established opinion. So like throughout the year, did you find that any things that you thought were true were challenged, or were any of your opinions challenged in big ways?
They definitely were. Just kind of seeing the intentionality of the government, especially after the Patriot Act. Like I said, it's easy to look back and think that it's obvious that this was not the right move. But at the same time, like especially after 9/11, just like the true state of panic that the United States was in, like I kind of see how we got to a point where we were passing like legislation that didn't really outline anything other than do whatever it takes to secure America.
Great job. Committee members, let's get a photo. Family members next. Let's get the first slide. Oh, can we get a charger?
Hey, Grace. Jake, do you have a charger for your computer? Oh, you want to take it? Oh, wait. Okay. I have like two music. No.
Anyone have a charger? Computer charger, quickly. Yes. Robert, get it, come through it. Clutch here. You have one?
What do you want, Grace? I'm waiting till we get this.
I'm trying to get that first slide.
Wait, Robert.
Robert, hurry. Hurry, Robert, hurry.
Yeah, I should be able to. Awesome.
Sense of urgency over here.
What you do down here?
Doesn't go to sleep after that.
Trust was a big theme this year. That came across like 3 or 4 projects this year. Trust in the system. Relax their own.
That in of itself is
You could do a whole thesis on that concept of trust. It has impacts on so many things. Okay, now we're back up.
No, but like as students that were also hyperfixating on that, or that were so hyper-conscious.
Okay, one is.
Right when we were 17, we like Tito's. Like, what does that mean?
Okay, we all set?
People that have you're like, what the heck is that?
Okay.
See you guys.
Yep. Wait, are we doing a group one now or family? Okay. Oh, yeah, we want one, right, yeah. Get the family up there. All right. Awesome. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you. I don't get so excited about Montana. My daughter lived here for several years. Her favorite place to travel to.
Hours away,
What's the big deal? Hey, have you been visiting me?
No, it's not.
No, you look great, man. You haven't changed a bit.
Leslie, get a picture with Sarah.
Oh, yeah. There, all right.
I would have told her to go.
Hey, Harrison, where you at? Man, the people is so much dead plan that I know.
Ready, 3,
But you got over it. You got the
yeah, let's go. Look at me. I'll take one. I'll go. I can.
All right. Kate, are we missing anyone?
How much did we say live stream for that?
I think Kai said it.
Yes.
Oh.
Look at me. Well, I want one,
Okay.
so. Can you want to jump in?
Okay.
We need a second.
Hurry up, hurry up.
We do.
Jay,
Wait,
we can't get the A3 class because Sarah's out sick. Hey. Good morning, front row. Yeah, yeah. 22 out of 22. Oh.
Should we go to Starbucks?
Four-time club.
I think we're gonna walk.
Yeah, you go ahead. You can't even walk to Starbucks there. You got to wear your heel, uncomfortable clothing. You can't do it. Well, they were nice. We had all these facilities in the class, and they would be walking to Starbucks every day. And I saw them more than waving them. Like, I feel like I need to just like still want to go to Starbucks. All right. We've got the team here. All right. Well, this is the second member of the Martin family, right? Any more Martins coming up?
No.
Is that it? Would you consider adopting a child like a third Martin?
We have to get like.
I hope Will's on there. Will, send me a text if you're on one. Right there. Read that before you start. You got it? Welcome to the final, 22nd and final thesis defense class of 2022. Awesome group of students. I was reflecting on my four-timers that in here earlier, and just it's been a great run with you guys. And talk about finishing at the perfect time. Of course, our signing day is tomorrow, so we're finishing this on a high note. I will say one of the most challenging topics were someone in youngsters, future thesis students here. I don't know, Presley, coming back in, you taking off. Okay, I'll see you guys later. All right, so again, the eclectic nature of these topics. We have everything from modern politics, to controversial issues. In this topic, again, a little bit off the beaten path, not our normal thesis topic, but Kate has taken an interest in classics and with some great mentors and advisors in this group right here. She's been able to run with it. This is, by the way, FYI, last project, but also the longest thesis project this year, at 125 pages, up higher. 127 pages. So this is the longest project this year. Again, those of you, getting ready for college, I think you're really going to enjoy this, and it blends together writing, classic studies, history, literature, all into a fabulous project. Let's give it up for Kate.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to my thesis defense. My name is Kate Martin, and I would like to introduce The Wife, the Witch, and the Warrior, a critical analysis into the female archetypes of classical Athenian literature and the effects those beliefs have on our modern understanding of gender roles. According to most modern historians, ancient Greece, specifically classical Athens, is the birthplace of Western civilization. Democracy, theater, thought, the arts, mathematics all find their roots during this age. Therefore, it is understandable to assume that the contemporary understanding of gender and sex also is the remnants of this culture. By observing the roles women play in the written records from classical Athens, we can better understand the roots of our own expectations of women and femininity. To begin, I would like to credit the many individuals and resources I used in this year-long endeavor. My research predominantly included classical literary journals, such as these listed, and other publications. Other sources I utilized were the books Pandora's Jar by Natalie Haynes and Goddesses, Whores, Wives, and Slaves by Sarah Pomeroy. Finally, I'd like to thank the interviews and direction I received from Caleb Dance, a professor at Washington University, and our own Rachel Print. The guidance given to me by both of these individuals is truly invaluable, as they instructed me in a subject I had no prior education in. Now, while I was influenced by the previously stated sources, I attempted to draw my own conclusions from the primary text that will later be mentioned. I referenced various translations of the works of Homer, Sophocles, Euripides, and other writers, historians, and philosophers over the course of this year. Now, the majority of these men share pretty much one significant similarity. They all are predominantly aristocratic, free men of high social standings. Because almost all of that has been written, has been done, created by, and preserved by men, the scope of our understanding of female roles in classical Athens is fairly narrow. In that sense, any information these men provide should be taken with a grain of salt, as, due to the established societal seclusion of women from the male sphere, it is unlikely that these figures interacted with many women who weren't their wives, mothers, or mistresses. Now, to begin, I would like to preface the role early texts play into the classical understanding of women and gender. The women within these writings would act as the bar all other women would be compared to, and their actions would act as lessons for why women are inherently inferior to men. One of these early examples of feminine misfortune is, of course, Pandora. Pandora, according to the writer Hesiod, is the first woman, the Greek's equivalent of Eve in the Garden of Eden. Her name, meaning all gifted or gift to all, references her creation by the Olympians Hephaestus and Athena, as she was endowed by each of the 12 Olympians, gifts fitting for a great wife: beauty, grace, dexterity, and from Hephaestus, lying and deceit. These are the attributes that make a woman. Pandora was no gift, after all. She was created to bring misfortune among mankind after Prometheus stole fire from Zeus. Zeus gives Pandora as a bride to Prometheus' brother, along with a jar and the warning to never open it. Pandora, like all women, unfortunately, had a lively curiosity, which prompted her to break the seal of the jar and unknowingly unleash all evils upon mankind. From that moment forth, men would be plagued by sickness, war, famine, and other evils, and women would be mistrusted. The myth of Pandora is significant because she represents not only the harmful nature of women, but the idea that women are a punishment and not a gift. In the words of Hesiod, she and all women like her are a snare, a futile thing for men. If left unattended, they are capable of evil and deceit. More importantly, the institution of marriage should also be treated with caution. Hesiod recommends that husbands should limit the freedoms of their wives, restrict how many children they bear. The poet also mentions that women tend to consume precious resources without making a contribution to the household wealth. Pandora invokes, therefore, the necessity for a woman to act as a sort of producer, offering gifts, i.e., open a jar, to make up for this discrepancy. But due to her gender, they should naturally not be trusted. Hesiod is described in one source as a bitter poet and a farmer in approximately 700 BCE. In his poem, The Theogony, he also describes the conquering Olympians over the old rule with very gendered language, referencing the old matriarch as inferior, wild, and barbarian. The divine progression from the female-dominated generations, characterized by natural, earthy, emotional qualities, to the superior and rational rule of Zeus is substantial. Whether this corresponds to a historic change in the Greek religion from emphasis on the worship of female divinities to that of male is unclear. It is highly probable that Hesiod, reflecting the ideas held by the population as a whole, was a raging misogynist, considering the matriarchy was overthrown by the civilizing Zeus. Hesiod, though writing centuries before classical Athens, invokes the same understanding of women as a similar Greek from the 4th century BCE, Aristotle. Aristotle is a philosopher who is as popular today as he was in classical Athens. In his Politics, the philosopher notes that the male is by nature superior and the female inferior. One is ruled and the other rules. This principle of necessity extends to all mankind. He justifies women's subordination on the belief that they are naturally inferior to men, and therefore belong in a house and away from powerful policymaking. This is actually a rejection of the teachings of his teacher, Plato. Plato understood that women had the same intellectual capacity as men and therefore deserved the same education. But you might ask, how is this prevalent in 2022? Aristotle's views are clearly flawed, and even his peers found fault in them. Unfortunately, the philosopher caused a major pattern that is still evident in many contemporary medical textbooks. Anthropologist Emily Martin likens his belief to the gendered language and stereotypes of the sperm and the egg in human fertilization. For example, how the masculine sperm are depicted as strong adventurers, heroes, and conquerors, actively swimming towards the egg and penetrating its defenses. The feminine egg, on the other hand, are described as passive and fragile, being swept along the fallopian tubes to await the arrival of sperm. Aristotle's understanding of the genetic inferiority of women is, again, clearly flawed, but he summarizes the Athenian understanding of women quite well. Women were generally found to be genetically, morally, and intellectually weaker than men. It is for this reason that they were restricted from participating in politics. Thus, a distinction between the male and female spheres arose during this time. Men were allowed to participate in the police, the state, and represent themselves in legal matters. They could vote, they could own property, while women were restricted to the home, the oikos, where they were expected to tirelessly manage the going-ons of the house, regulate what came in and went out, take care of the children, direct the slaves, and most importantly, not leave the confines of the property, even that of her own woman quarters. Penelope from Homer's Odyssey is the best example of this. The Queen of Ithaca, wife to the legendary Odysseus, she's by far the best example of the restrictions placed upon aristocratic Greek wives. Despite the large number of suitors in her home, she remains out of sight at the back of the house. When before the men, she is veiled, the emblem of modesty. Penelope is dedicated to the care and preservation of her home in her husband's absence, and in the 20 years since he's been gone, she's done exceptionally well. In every instance, even after her husband returns, home disguised, she's a perfect host. From the safety of her home, she's acted as the perfect caretaker, mother, and woman. Penelope also abandons the traditional helpless quality of woman. She's not the ingenue, but is capable of her own protection. For instance, after it is assumed that Odysseus will not be returning, Penelope, still holding on to hope, asked the suitors for time to finish her weaving the shroud for Laertes, Odysseus' father. She spent the long hours of the day weaving, and at night would remove the stitches so that her work would never be completed, thus buying her husband valuable time. Though Penelope utilizes the female-coded skill of weaving in order to protect herself and therefore what belongs to her husband, she does so in a way that almost corrupts the naivety of the act. Homer characteristically employs the skill by other women, such as Helen in the Iliad. These women use weaving and working on the loom as a tool. In some instances, they almost weaponize it. In doing so, these women almost appear masculine, considered the Greek sense. Penelope is very much like her husband in her cleverness. This is evident in the poet's use of huphainen metaphorically. Its literal meaning is to describe the craft of the loom, though figuratively, it can also be used to describe the devising of wiles, as one might weave their words together. Yet Penelope is not venerated for these factors alone, for it is not only the roles of wife that makes a good woman a woman. Penelope is also extremely dedicated to her husband, especially when compared to her cousin, the wife of Agamemnon, Clytemnestra. These women share many similarities. Both spent decades alone while their husbands fought in the same war. Both ruled their homes successfully. Both are masters of the traditional female-coded skill of weaving. At the same time, both were extremely clever, though cleverness was considered to be a male-coded attribute. Most importantly, both were tempted by suitors in their husband's absence. But while Penelope remains loyal and spent the majority of her time mourning her husband upon their marriage bed, Clytemnestra was motivated by her greed and anger. Penelope is balanced. She understands her role as wife, but her loyalty is not to her role, but to her husband. She is prepared to abandon the role she holds as woman for the sake of her husband, as the proper procedure for a woman in her circumstance would have been to give the property of her home to her adult grown son, to return to her father so that she could be reissued a dowry and then be remarried. In not doing so, she actually protects Odysseus' home for his return. At the same time, she puts the house, Odysseus, herself, and her son in great personal risk. Clytemnestra, on the other hand, took her husband's role as king and as the head of house in his absence. She unbalances the male-female relationship by taking on male-coded roles. Clytemnestra would have been the most hated woman in classical Athens because she would represent the possibility of all wives. Men would want to have a woman at home who would be there with them in their most vulnerable moments. To have that person be the cause of your downfall would be the greatest misfortune possible. Clytemnestra would be the example of the worst wife possible, and she would be used again and again to remind men what happens when you give your wife too much freedom. She will take on a lover, take over your kingdom, and kill you in the bath. This is evident in a legal battle from the late 5th century BCE. At Athena's legendary legal courts, a young Athenian accused his stepmother of poisoning his father. Apparently, at a close friend's home, the stepmother had convinced a slave to poison both the father and the host. Before the trial could be executed, the slave was. But because the stepmother could not represent herself in an Athenian court, her son defended her. The plaintiff, her stepson, had no evidence recalling that she was the murderer. Instead, he crafted a story of deception and treachery, saying that the slave had not masterminded the murder, but was the accomplice to this Clytemnestra here. Also, similar to Penelope and other women of Grecian literature, Clytemnestra weaponizes the act of weaving. Knowing that she could not beat her husband in a battle of force, she tricked him into taking a bath and casted a net upon him. Unable to free himself, Agamemnon could only watch as his wife rose an axe above his head and bore it down upon him. One thing becomes immediately clear in this passage. Notice the diction shift from the weaving and working on the loom to the word net. Clytemnestra is not a woman spending all day on a loom weaving delicate images. She's a hunter, catching a beast in a trap. The woman is, for all intents and purposes, male. The act alone is more threatening to the men of Athens than any other, to consider that their woman had the capability to rule their homes in their absence, and eventually to rule the house on their own. If women could do this, what was the need of men? To be docile, fragile underlings, of course. Though Clytemnestra's justification for her crime differs between authors and eras, her cause is greatly harmed by her infidelity. For those who are unfamiliar, Clytemnestra killed Agamemnon for a multitude of reasons. Male-like ambition, the retribution for the death of their daughter, or because the queen had become a relationship with Aegisthus, who had shared a blood feud with the king of Argos. Some have the lover slaying the queen's husband, others have him merely being the accomplice to Clytemnestra's mastermind. Some sources have the man use Clytemnestra to overthrow the king and take his place on the throne. Aeschylus instead emphasizes the feminine nature of Aegisthus. He has a course at the end of Agamemnon criticize the man for his cowardness, saying he hadn't gone to Troy, but instead, like a woman, waited out the war here in the house, shaming the master's bed with lust, and planned against the lord of the house this treacherous death. He did not kill Agamemnon, but instead required a woman to do a male's duty. His existence delegitimizes Clytemnestra's claim to retribution, and is likely a result of their relationship and her portrayal of her husband that Athens' adultery laws were much more strict than their laws for rape. Examples of this are seen in the adultery laws towards women, which were more strict than those towards their husbands. The offending male, who could also be found guilty of seducing another man's wife, suffered a penalty worse than if he had found guilty for the act of rape. In a city where only men and male children belonged to the family in any permanent sense, but where women were easily transferred to from their fathers' families to those of their successive husbands, men were readily suspicious about the loyalty of women to the families in which they found themselves. Clytemnestra also leads us to the third stigma against women that persists in our modern world, the stigma against female sexuality. As seen in earlier examples, a sexually mature woman is prone to skepticism. Even Penelope is doubted by Athena, and Clytemnestra seems to prove over and over again the dangers of a sexually active woman. To summarize, a sexually immature young woman is less likely to commit infidelities and could therefore be trusted by men. She is young, impressionable, and most importantly, not likely to lead a man down a trail of passion and sin. Now, Grecian women could be categorized into two other categories: virgins and prostitutes. With the phrase virgin goddess, it's likely an image comes to your head. Artemis, Athena, Hestia, these are the good goddesses, not the vain Hera, the lust of Aphrodite. Even Demeter isn't sinless. Athena is an example of this pure and chaste goddess. In literature alone, she receives the most attention of any woman, maybe even any Olympian. In the city of Athens, she's also massively popular. This is likely due to the fact that she's a masculine goddess. Traditionally, Athena is not the war-minded feminist that modern media depicts her. In Homer's epics, the goddess more often assumes the body of a mortal man in order to facilitate contact with her favorite heroes. For instance, when Odysseus is speaking to a disguised Athena, he does so in the form of a childhood friend and trusted confidant of his mentor. Athena also predominantly favors the male during any male-female antagonisms, almost going as far to have an immediate biased distrust of women. This is seen in her suspicions towards Odysseus' otherwise virtuous wife, Penelope. If that sounds familiar, it's because it is. Athena is taking on the role of the typical Athenian male. Her success as a goddess is found by essentially denying her femininity and sexuality in favor of the male ideal. It is because of this that she was Zeus's favorite and a peer amongst the male gods. Her asexual tendencies are quintessential for male acceptance at the Olympian pattern, often serve as the ideal, and because of which the virginal goddesses are more widely praised than those who had reached sexual maturity. A fully realized female tends to engender anxiety in the insecure male. This is a common theme that appears further and often within the studies of ancient women. The villains are often those that are sexually mature, while those who are praised are often younger and have restrained themselves from acts of lust entirely. Additionally, the notion of the virginal goddesses also defines the relationship between a goddess and a mortal, which could only be widely regarded as inspirational, protective, and holy in order to be accepted. When this occurs, the goddess is likely a virgin. A psychoanalytical criticism of classical literature suggests that the very fact of virginhood provides the reason for Athena's constructive and friendly relationships with the majority of Greek heroes. According to this theory, a man could feel secure in their relationships with a superior female as long as that female was a virgin, likely because the Greeks believed that women were incapable of not exercising their sexual charms, and that the results were often catastrophic, irrespective of whether a woman intended to cause trouble or not. Therefore, Athena's virginhood only exists in order to satisfy the male anxiety of female sexuality. To have her favor men routinely is one thing. To have her constantly persecute women proves that Athena, though a female goddess, is more of an Athenian male than a woman herself. The other end of the spectrum are women who maintain their sexuality, though are still regarded as outsiders through Athenian society. Prostitution was one of the many occupations that free, non-citizen women could rise in stature, though it came in many forms. The hetairai are the most common form of prostitution in classical literature. They are considered to be courtesans or mistresses, often supported by one or two men alone, serving as their companion at symposium and revels, as well as servicing their sexual desires. Their counterparts are the porni, streetwalkers or occupants of brothels, providing sex for payment to a large and anonymous clientele. These women's services exclusively cater to the commercial pleasuring of men. Other examples include the sacred prostitutes to the temple of Aphrodite. While many examples of courtesans exist in Athenian records, my favorite is that of Aspasia, the companion to Pericles, who was the most influential man in Athenian politics. This high-class courtesan brought Pericles erotic as well as intellectual stimulation, and impressive and keen wit that even Socrates praised. Plato jokes that she probably wrote some of Pericles' famous speeches. Aspasia was a courtesan, a prostitute who was essentially paid for companionship, yet she was brought into the home of Athens' most prominent celebrity. While courtesans were a normal aspect of Athenian society, it was highly irregular to welcome one into one's home and treat her in the manner of one's wife. Furthermore, Aspasia was a foreigner, which sparked much xenophobia in Athenian debates, as well as criticism for Pericles' politics in the political spheres. She was called a whore and her son a bastard. She was widely distrusted as apparently she used her abilities to persuade Pericles to bring important Greek men over to the Persian cause during the Persian War. She also is said to have manipulated Pericles for her own political purposes, yet Aspasia represented something much more to the traditional Athenian gender roles than her critics attempted to bind her. She was a figure whose power and influence frightened men because it was unnatural and impossible to control. Because she acted in ways unsuitable for a woman in high society, she brought much consternation to the home and reputation of Pericles. In fact, she's an excellent example of the distrust most Athenian men felt towards women who broke the boundaries of their gender and played into a deeper distrust of women as a whole. Unfortunately, this has been only a fraction of the focuses and examples that I was able to tackle in my thesis. Even so, these examples are by no means exhaustive, and each example contains the bias of the source. One instance of this is with Euripides. Ironically, this example does not follow a play of Euripides. Instead, in a comedy written by Aristophanes, the father comedy, the women of Athens band together in assembly to accuse Euripides of slandering their gender, all as whores and adulteresses. Whether Aristophanes' characterization of Euripides as misogynist is truthful or not, it greatly influenced how the playwright was perceived by others in history. For instance, in the mid-2nd century AD, it was claimed that Euripides' own wife was the cause of his hatred for marriage. While other examples of the contrary exist, with the abundance of denouncement against the female sex within his plays, Euripides' resentment is clear. In Melancholy, a character shares that the worst plague is a hated race of women, and except my mother, I hate the whole female sex. In the same play, a woman responds, women manage the home and preserve the goods which are brought from abroad. Houses where there is no wife are neither orderly nor prosperous. And in religion, and I take this to be important, we women play a large part. How then can it be that just the female sex should be abused? Shall not men cease their foolish reproaches, cease to blame all women alike if they meet one who is bad? The confusion of Euripides is likely due to the fact that the perspectives of women that he writes are starkly different. Meanwhile, poets' true beliefs remain a mystery, and we can still learn from his stories. Stories that provide lessons for our own culture, how we subconsciously approach women and gender. The stories of Penelope, Pandora, Clytemnestra, and many others have their effects on the Athenian daily lives, and consequently, ours. Thank you for attending my thesis.
challenging part of this really unique, awesome project? You were dealing with primary literature as far as organization of such a vast project, the writing itself. What was the most challenging part?
Well, I don't speak Greek, which was really the biggest challenge I found, because many of the literary journals that I cite in my paper, they are written for classicists who are proficient in ancient Greek. And they have entire passages which are in ancient Greek that I have had to essentially cut out and ignore. Because I was required to depend on the translations, I found that it is easier to fall in the trap of the bias of the translator when you are not knowing really who's writing what. An example of this is that studying women in the classics is a newer trend, maybe in the past century or two. Prior to that, Euripides' word would have been taken as law, just because the main demographic of classicists were white aristocratic men. When women started being able to be introduced into this field, they started bringing with them different perspectives, which is why I can speak on this now. So that was really the greatest challenge, was trying to get past the translator bias.
Any parallels that you saw or would want to explore in future projects with other societies, kind of as a comparative analysis?
Oh, there was a lot of connections I found between the study of the classics and Christianity. And again, this is likely due to the fact that the demographic for classicists used to be very, very limited. But you really can't look up anything about Pandora without being directed to the story of Eve. Those are kind of correlated together. So really just the Christian values have kind of morphed their way over the past 2,000 years into an understanding of the classics. So if I were to tackle it again, I would almost try to, again, this requires me having much greater knowledge in ancient Greek and translations, but I would like to kind of divide that bias from the original sources.
Great. We'll turn over to the committee. Who wants to start?
I loved how you approached this project, and it was like in these sections, and you were so focused in it. Did the overall organization of the paper morph or shift as you developed your ideas and really dug into the research? And which one was the most eye-opening or interesting, or maybe that you didn't expect?
Yeah. I kind of fell into a trap. I named my thesis before that I had done in the majority of the research. So I had known that when I was tackling it, I wanted to divide the archetypes into these three categories, which I do in bulk in my written work that I wasn't able to do here. And because of that, I had maybe a list of 6 or 7 examples that I really wanted to talk about in each category. I want to talk about Atalanta in the warrior category, or Medusa and her kind of role, and I found that I wasn't able to do it all. So maybe that's a continuation to that question earlier, is that I would like to do an even more in-depth study and tackle more examples, just because it was so interesting. But yeah, because I categorized it way too early, I found that what I assumed would be a chapter, my middle chapter is about witches and villainesses traditionally. I had expected that to be pretty cut and dry, and then when I was looking into it, I found that there was the moral conundrum, and it's women kind of acting as defenders of justice and stuff like that totally threw me in a loop.
But you let the writing and the research lead that to something.
There's so much, I could geek out on this for days.
Which we have. I would like to talk about the cutting room floor and some of the things that I have one that you cut from your presentation that's also in your paper that Medea That's the one, like, yeah, that one hurt, the fact that one's on the cutting room floor, that one hurt me. But I was wondering, what were some of the things that you had to cut because of time that you want to give a shout out to?
Medea was definitely a factor. If you take the time to read through my thesis, you can kind of see that each section and each one of my chapters has a greater theme, where Medea is kind of talking about divine justice and injustice, and she is punishing Jason not because of his crime he committed against her, but because he deserved it. Alcestis, who's in my first chapter, she's an example of a good wife. She's entirely loyal to her husband, and the fact that she gives her own life so that his could be extended. And during the course of that tragedy, Hercules comes and he finds his king and his dead wife, and he goes to the underworld and takes the wife back up, and then they'll celebrate at the end, which is a great story and not at all a tragedy like it's labeled, except for the fact that Alcestis is given one right in her life, and that is the right to die. When that was the one choice she was able to make. Her husband's parents, all of his servants, he's a loved king, all of his citizens, no one would make that sacrifice, and she was able to make that choice. And then at the very end, to have that choice taken from her is kind of to say that, that was your one last freedom.
What surprised you? Or who surprised you? Both in the descriptions and the stories.
Probably Lysistrata, because I was unfamiliar with her, and I had also not read any of Aristophanes' work. And if you read any of his comedies, they're not exactly PG. There's a lot of inappropriate jokes that I won't go into detail about. But the main purpose of that was a kind of serious relabeling of what it means to be a woman and what a woman is capable of. Because if you're not familiar with Lysistrata, it's during the Peloponnesian War. Athens is at war with Sparta, and all the women decide that we're going to go on a sex strike so our husbands get it through their heads that we don't want to keep fighting this war. And, it works, and it's great, but then you have to remember that it's written as a comedy. So is Aristophanes really bringing women up, or is he saying, look at this crazy thing that could happen if we gave women anything? Forget it. So that was surprising. I loved it.
Ms. King?
I thought you did a wonderful job with such fantastic analysis. And this is not an area I have any background in, so I'm sorry if my questions. But who was the target audience? Who was reading this at the time when it was written?
If I'm dreadfully honest, Miss Prim was probably my target audience.
Well, I mean, the material, like, who was in society?
My target. Sorry.
Who was
incredibly
who was reading these stories? Because I'm just like wondering, are they cautionary tales? I mean, like, who was the intended audience?
So all of the stories, I don't think there's an example of one that I don't cover, is meant to be told orally. Homer and Hesiod, they're poets, but they're meant to be, all of their stories are meant to be sang out for a group. They're telling about kind of the glory of heroes. So their audience was really any Greek, because any Greek could kind of appreciate what it meant to be an Achilles or an Odysseus and that kind of strong and glory of it. Well, but later, when you get to your Euripides, your Sophocles, those are written in order to be performed. They're all plays. And traditionally, except for I think traditionally, except for a few festivals, they were performed for a male audience. So all of these need to be taken under the scope that this is a entertainer writing for men. This is not an entertainer writing because he's a massive feminist.
It seemed like, even though, there was more of an acceptance of, say, gender fluidity, or even in some of the stories like Penelope, like she was being almost defiant, you know, and it's interesting because in their own ways, they were going against the expected norms at the time. And it was really fascinating. But I was just wondering, they were viewed as bad, as
I know that my presentation can be a little cut and dry.
it's a lot, but
Yes.
it's fantastic.
Yeah. No is really the short answer. Yes, Penelope does not always conform to the traditional norms of what it meant to be a woman and what it meant to be a queen. But in doing so, she proves that there's something of more importance than being a good housewife, and that's being a good wife. Her number one is always Odysseus, and that's kind of the point of the story Alcestis, is that you can abandon your role as wife as long as you're doing it for one man.
I got you. It's great. I loved it. Thanks.
We've got a few minutes for questions from the audience.
So I've been thinking about like the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, and then you told the story about that one girl, what's her name, who died, and like
Alcestis.
so what's the relationship between Orpheus and Eurydice in that story? And if you had to define this, I don't know if you talked about the story, but if you had to define it, Eurydice in the wife, witcher, warrior category, which one would she fall into?
I would actually define Eurydice as a coat rack. She doesn't really do anything for that story. Arguably, the story of Orpheus and Eurydice is not about Eurydice. It's about a man's love for her. Ovid actually says it really, really well in his book Metamorphosis, which is the only record that I know of the myth of Odysseus and Eurydice. And he says, basically, it's about Orpheus going through all this turmoil. He goes down, he makes all these great acts with his music. And then once he gets up at kind of the breath of the cave that leads into the underworld, he turns around, he sees his wife disappearing behind. And Ovid says that how could Eurydice be upset because she knows that she's loved? Which, just in reference to that story, that's my favorite thing about it. But no, Eurydice isn't really a major character because she's dead for half of it. In the same way that Alcestis is characterized by her one choice, Eurydice didn't have a choice. Eurydice is just some dude's wife.
You, watching your defense on multiple occasions, you could see your smile come on as you love this. Does it carry on into the next year?
It does carry on into the next year.
Tell us about that. What are you going to study and why, and has this launched you?
It actually has in like a quite literal sense. I referenced Professor Dance from Washington University. My brother goes to Washington University, so I was kind of given the opportunity when we went there for Parents Weekend.
Yeah.
I knocked on all the doors in the classics department. I knocked on like their department head, their department chair, and I'm like, I love this. Give me some books to read. And he was really helpful. And then he gave me his email so that I could Zoom him later. And next year, I'm taking one of his classes at Washington University just because that I loved him as just like a teacher. He teaches, he's a classical studies and a women's studies kind of focus. It's literally what I'm doing here. And, you know, it was great. And just that opportunity.
It's fun as an educator to see you light up when you're talking about this stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really passionate. I'm actually not allowed to talk about it at home anymore.
Yes.
Yeah. Great.
In what ways do you think like the autodidactical nature of like you taking this on, not having any sort of like actual teaching, or like you had this credit but we didn't have a class on this? So like in what ways do you think that challenged you as a scholar and made you be more appreciative of like the opportunities that you are bound to in college?
Yeah. I do know that I'm gonna have to step ahead next year, but also the entire process of this thesis, I was texting Miss Prim, I'm like, can I say this is legit? Can I say this? Or am I just like making assumptions about something that I only have like a very narrow view? Because with some of my stories and some of my conclusions that I drew, I was making some stretches. So not having a formal background and, you know, a class where we could do this in bulk was a great challenge. Thankfully, Ms. Prim is very patient. So, thank you for that.
Kind of based on that question, but how did your personal bias influence how you like not only your research but how you wrote it?
How did me being a feminist?
Believing that women deserve basic human rights.
Right. That's a really good question. Really, everything we do is influenced by our own personal. I would not have tackled this project if I didn't have, you know, some interest in women's studies. And, you know, I was a Percy Jackson kid. I read the Iliad in 6th grade, and that was a mistake. And then I read it again later, and that was still a mistake. But doing that, I took note as just a young woman that the examples and myths in which women were prominent, especially the myth of Medusa. The myth of Medusa is that Medusa was raped in Athena's temple. She is a priestess of Athena. She's raped by Poseidon in Athena's temple, and Athena is horrified that her temple was defiled. And instead of punishing Poseidon, she curses Medusa with this, you know, the Medusa-ness. And a lot of, I haven't seen any backing of it, but I have heard in just kind of more modern circles, people have tried to say that that was a gift, that Athena gave Medusa the right to protect herself from any male further, which is great, which is totally very, very cool, but you don't take into consideration other myths that were as prominent, like the myth of Perseus. Athena gives Perseus his shield and, I'm pretty sure, the sword that he uses to cut Medusa's head off. In going through all my research, knowing that and knowing just the feelings that I have as a feminist really fueled me to write as hard or write as much as I did, because there was just so much that I wanted to cover that I just ran out of time.
So you said you're a Percy Jackson kid.
That was a mistake.
So Annabeth Chase, if Annabeth Chase was put back in ancient Greece, how do you think they would interpret her character?
Are you asking me to characterize a required book?
Yeah.
From what I remember, she'd probably not do too well because she's not, you know, a wife. And really, independent women were kind of seen as like the streetwalkers. You know, when they were up to something nefarious, a woman could not do any legal actions herself. She needed what was called a curios, which could be a father, brother, husband, or like uncle. It just was a male representative for her to buy food, basically everything to a certain extent, but really everything she needed to have a male for. I can't imagine that, you know, a modern feminist would ever take too kindly to that, but it's my personal opinion.
So you mentioned throughout the presentation that there are certain Greek characters that we know very well of because those Greek characters were raised by men at the time. And so do you think that the characters who were not appraised by men at the time because of their supposed wickedness, their sexuality, and stuff like that, do you think those types of characters are the ones that should be sort of spread more throughout like media and readings and stuff to teach feminism, or do you think those characters still sort of remain as they were, which were written terribly, or as people would?
The really interesting thing about just the classics as a whole is that it's really easy for me to say that I know the whole picture, but I don't. Because somebody might, you know, dig up a pot in the near future that throws the entire myth of Clytemnestra just out the window because we don't have the full story because we are always dealing with fragments. the fragments that have stuck around have been the ones that Athenian men, not just Athenian men, but the ones that men have loved, right? There is probably great examples of, I guess, female characters who, you know, she tried to do too much. You know, she's a little too feminist, and then because she didn't have that male appeal, we lost her. We might find her again, and then yes, that would be an excellent example. But just because of the nature of history and the nature of having to dig up history, it's unlikely that we're going to find more remnants.
Can I ask one other follow-up? So for a character like Athena, or something like that, why do you think because when most a general audience thinks of Athena, they do think of this very powerful sort of goddess, but her original character is, in modern day, misogynistic. Why did you think she's the feminist sort of leader in Greek mythology?
The Greeks actually did this thing where they would take one character, like Athena, and instead of treating her like a 365-degree, like a whole person, they would take remnants of her personality. The Athena Parthenos translates to Virgin Athena. It's where we get the word Parthenon. They took that one aspect of her personality and worshipped that aspect of her. Does that, I guess, help a little bit? Because the ancient Greeks tended to fracture and not treat Athena as a whole. Sorry. Because they tended to fracture and treat Athena like as her parts. One was justice, one was victory, one was war. We don't kind of get the idea of Athena as a whole. And we do that in the modern scenario too. We think of Athena as, you know, wisdom. We don't think of her when she, you know, is overly vain and curses Arachne into being a spider forever. That's where we get spiders. We don't think about that. You know, it's nice. It's appealing to be that one fragment.
Great. Any thesis students want to hang out, we'll do like a kind of a random group photo maybe at the end after we get this ending right now. All right, Preeti, are you the photographer still?
Yeah.
All right.
You want me to go back to it?
Yeah, go back to the first slide.
I'm choking on my spit.
My mom has it.
Yes, yes, yes. And with the camera you look at, like I use them to like light it. Yeah. Like, this is where they make it. Yeah. When I talk about in having this is like a release inner and lighting, this is what I'm talking about. Yes.
All right. How are you? You have a lead guy? You got a lead? Okay. We'll get a big group photo tomorrow. All right, Mr. Tripp, you want to get on that one side? Tripp, you want to get on the one side? Okay. Ready? You got this?
All right, look at me. 3, 2, 1.
All right. Let's get one solo shot, and then we'll get a family shot. Okay.
Would you like me to take You gotta Photoshop.
Yeah.
All right, any remaining thesis students, come on up, let's do one photo. Last day, last day. Come on, Sid. Anyone here from the class?
I was like, literally, I was laughing. I just have to think like I should never be the sword.
All right.
Oh no, I will.
You what?
Even at 0.5. You might need to do 2 rounds.
Thank you so much.
1, 2, 3.
Got it? 2022! Yes! Good job, guys. No idea.
Oh my god. Today comes
All the stickiness
Hey, jokes. Well, I guess it could be. Yeah, I mean, I'm just happy that it happened for a decade straight. I mean, it's crazy. Well, this is my first one. So having a vote at the same university would be convenient. I wasn't sure what you
Right there.
Oh, hi guys. Thank you for watching all of our Thesis Defenses. If you're watching this right now, we appreciate you.
We hope you enjoyed it.
We hope you. Hold on, wait.
He's gonna have the final word.
We hope you enjoyed, and we love you guys. And
Bye.
thank you. And you'll be back here next year to watch more defenses. But okay, bye.
Wait.
Oh.
Class of wait, what is it? Good luck, Charlie.
Oh yeah.
And if you're ever in thesis, well, good luck, Charlie.
That'll forever be on YouTube. It's cute. Okay, here we go.